to bring the necessary equipments with him and install them in Shantiniketan. A few of those equipments were bought, but majority could not be bought because J.C. Bose's concern was that where would we find a sufficiently trained technician to run them and teach them to the villages. So that was, to a certain extent, shelved for the time being. But that was one of the incidents which prompted Rabindranath to send his son and his son-in-law to Illinois to be trained as agricultural scientists, as well as technicians who would be versatile, conversant with using modern equipment in agriculture. J.C. Bose and his wife, Lady Obola, they did not have any children. In fact, they had one daughter who died in her infancy. So, J.C. Bose's nephews were he was in loco parentis to his nephews. And one particular nephew who was very, very close to Lady Obola was sent to Shantiniketan as a student in the ashram. And this essentially precipitated into a sort of misunderstanding between Rabindranath and Jagadish Chandra and Lady Obola, because Lady Obola started missing her nephew very badly, and apparently the nephew was also feeling homesick, so he was looking for an excuse to come back to Kolkata, as children would, as we all know. So Obola wrote a letter to Rabindranath saying that I'm toying with the idea of bringing the nephew back and keeping him here. Apparently he's not keeping well. Rabindranath seemed to have taken a lot of umbrage at that letter. And he wrote back saying that, well, there was a reference to a festival at Shantiniketan that Sushanta showed pictures of, and Lady Obola jokingly complained that this time you are not inviting us to come there. And Rabindranath's response to that was that I have felt that you are not very kindly disposed to my ideals of the school, and therefore you are not welcome here. We can keep our association anywhere else, but not in here. I don't want detractors to the philosophy that I'm trying to espouse here. So that breach took many years to heal. But then, once Rabindranath got the Nobel Prize, the reception that was organized was chaired by Jagadish Chandra Bose. And that started their exchange of letters again, but the frequency had certainly come down. And to a certain extent, the same warmth did not reveal itself anymore. But that is also to be expected. I think Rabindranath himself explained that at the obituary lecture that he delivered after the death of Jagadish Chandra Bose. And he explained that the time when we met were both of us in our early youth. And we were both looking for recognition on the international front. Rabindranath, in some contexts, said that he had definitely believed that after the discovery of, once Nobel Prize was instituted, Jagadish Bose would be one of the first recipients of the Nobel Prize. And this is something which he was supported in that belief by none other than Lord Kelvin, who was extremely supportive, Lord Kelvin and Lord Rayleigh, who were both extremely supportive of J.C. Bose's achievements. But that was not to be. And why that did not happen has occupied the historians of science to some extent, especially in Bengal, in India. And there is some hint of what could have happened is contained in a letter written by J.C. Bose to Rabindranath Tagore. Actually, Rabindranath and J.C. Bose exchanged a large number of letters between themselves, which are now collected. And in fact, Rabindranath himself commented that these letters, if preserved and collected and put in proper reference, this could provide a history and understanding of the way things developed in Bengal during this period, late 19th and early 20th century. So in such a letter, J.C. Bose wrote to Rabindranath that I was giving a lecture at the Royal Institution, at the Royal Society, not the Royal Institution. The Royal Institution was the very first lecture. On a subsequent visit, 1899 or 1897, okay, he was giving a lecture on this wireless transmission. And during the presentation, there were a lot of representatives from the telegraph companies who came up and beseeched him not to reveal all details of his experiment. And they kept saying that we will take out patents, you don't know how much money there is in it. Okay. But J.C. Bose apparently turned them down. So after the lecture, there was a huge melee. People came up to ask him questions, shake his hands, and so on. And in that melee, his handwritten notes, which were on the podium, disappeared. This J.C. Bose wrote to Tagore. And researchers later on established that Marconi was in the audience at that lecture. And then one of the primary features of J.C. Bose's success was in his detector design. He had designed what is now called the horn antenna. And horn antennas continue to be used in millimeter wave astronomy, as many in the audience already know. And Marconi had been trying to conduct wireless transmission of signals for many, many years prior to that. But then he succeeded in 1899, and it was shown that he succeeded because he changed his detectors and followed the horn antenna design. So when he was asked that how did he come up with the idea of the horn antenna, he gave it the excuse that Righi was his mentor. Righi told him to use it. When Righi was asked, he said, no, I don't know anything about horn antenna. But that's where the matter stopped. So Rabindranath's expectation that J.C. Bose would be one of the early winners of the Nobel Prize did not happen. Marconi was awarded the Nobel Prize. And when J.C. Bose was asked whether he felt any bitterness at being overlooked, his answer was that, well, as long as the work is done, that's what matters. who gets the award is somewhat irrelevant. The success of this collaboration or the friendship between Rabindranath and J.C. Bose manifested itself, as I mentioned, in 1913, when Rabindranath got the Nobel Prize, the first Asian to get a Nobel in Literature and the first Indian to get any Nobel at all. J.C. Bose was the chair of the reception that was organized, and he represented the feeling of the Indian population that they were proud and happy that Rabindranath finally got the honor and recognition that most of his devotees felt he had already deserved. The response that Rabindranath gave at that reception is, again, something very, very interesting. He said that this cup of elixir that you have offered me, I gratefully accept it, raise it to my lips, but I do not want to drink it. And his resentment at having been ignored by his own countrymen was manifested in that. J.C. Bose felt the same, but he also later on chided Rabindranath that he should not have publicly denounced the efforts and the genuine love of people, however belated and however prompted by the recognition from the West. But that is the way it is. Now, how am I doing for time, Mr. Chairman? Finished?
Trying to finish it, maybe a couple of minutes.
Okay, good. The level of their, in the depth of their interaction is probably exemplified by the fact that Rabindranath dedicated 8 of his poems to J.C. Bose, by far the largest number to any male, and he dedicated his Katha or Kahini, one of his very famous and his own favorite collection of a book collection of poems, to Jagadish Chandra. Jagadish Chandra wrote several pieces of science-related articles as well as a few fictions in Bengali, which the collection is by the name of published under the name of Obokto, the Unmanifested, which he dedicated again to Rabindranath. And their complementarity in thoughts go to the extent that when J.C. Bose founded Bose Institute, the first institution in all of Asia dedicated to full-time research and declaredly in cross-disciplinary sciences, science without any boundaries of discipline. Rabindranath wrote the inaugural song for the institution, which is still sung at every Foundation Day celebration of Bose Institute. When Rabindranath founded Vishwabharati, J.C. Bose was the vice president, of Vishwabharati. But at the same time, J.C. Bose went on record requesting Rabindranath and many times not to get too deeply involved in administrative issues like those of Shantiniketan Vishwabharati. His complaint was that this was interfering with Rabindranath's creativity. And to that extent, even though he was made the first vice president of Vishwabharati, his involvement with Vishwabharati, as far as the records could be unveiled, was limited to writing a check of 500 rupees as donation. Rabindranath was also a member of the Board of Governors of Bose Institute when it was founded. There is no evidence that he took much interest or active role in the running of this institute, except to ensure that when J.C. Bose died, his successor would be his nephew, an established and well-known physicist by the name of D.M. Bose, who was a professor of Calcutta University at that time. So this complementarity between J.C. Bose and Rabindranath was a lifelong affair, and which, by all reckoning, molded the evolution of the Bengal Renaissance to a large extent. All the scientists of the early 20th century in Bengal that we know of, Meghnad Saha, J.C. Bose, except for Raman, okay, all of them were students of J.C. Bose, okay, and all of them were extremely close to Rabindranath Tagore. It's a coincidence that all these people that I named have had books or pieces of literature penned by Rabindranath dedicated to them. So, let me just wind up by making one observation. People have always wondered that what cemented this relation between Rabindranath and J.C. Bose. As has already been said, J.C. Bose was not a full-time literature or an artist. He always said that the language of science and the arts are somewhat different. Scientist is bound by the requirement that you have to go by step and logical step to step. Making leaps of faith is somewhat unaccepted in the field of science. Okay. But all of us are looking for truth in the long run. J.C. Bose's philosophy was that he could look at signals of transmission in living systems as well as in any inanimate objects, and he found strong similarities between them. And at that time, he claimed that this is the kind of indication of the all-pervading consciousness as depicted in the Upanishads. So once Rabindranath was asked that what drew him to J.C. Bose's scientific practices, he said that we have been brought up on the lessons of Upanishads. My feeling was that maybe this is the experimental evidence that is being provided by J.C. Bose. The attitudes have changed. When J.C. Bose first said it, his tremendous reputation that he had got by demonstrating the wireless signal transmission was just ruined in almost a flash. The Western world designated him as a charlatan. They said that he's a mystic who does not have faith in the scientific methods and is making guesses without any proof. And Jesse answer to that was to make more and more sophisticated experiments to show that what he was observing was right. And at the 150th birth anniversary of Jesse Bose, there was a conference, international conference, held at Cambridge, at Christ College, where the consensus emerged that if Jesse Bose's electromagnetic research was 60 years ahead of its time, his electrophysiology research, where he found signals in animate objects, which looked very much like signals in inanimate objects, and which led him to conclude that there is some kind of basic intelligence in plant systems, was 100 years ahead of their times, because this is now coming to be proven. In fact, Jesse Bose apparently was detecting single cell signals which could not be trusted or believed by scientists of the West at that time. So in search of truth and beauty, the role of sophisticated science, sophisticated scientific measurements cannot be undone, cannot be looked down upon, and that is essentially the meeting point between aesthetics and science. The search for truth and beauty is not the domain of only science or only arts. There is this common ground which these two gentlemen tried to find, and we would like to follow them in their footsteps. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so you might not have mentioned Shivaji Raha retired as director of the Bose Institute, and is also a QCD, QGP man, so is the most appropriate person to talk about the two kindred souls in the cosmos, Rabindranath Tagore and J.C. Bose. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a lunch break. Now, let me just also